On cold nights in Point Pleasant, long before the screams rose from the river, people whispered that something was watching them. Not a man, not an animal, something else. A shape with wings wider than a car, eyes burning red in the dark, and a presence that left even the bravest men unable to breathe. At first, the town thought it was a monster, a threat, a nightmare sprung to life from the abandoned ruins of the old TNT plant. But the truth they couldn't see, the truth no one understood until it was too late, is that monsters don't always come to destroy. Sometimes, they come to warn. And 1 year after the first sighting, as families hurried across the Silver Bridge for Christmas shopping, the unthinkable happened. The bridge collapsed in a single shattering sigh of steel, and the creature was never seen again. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a town of 7,000 souls nestled where the Kanawha River meets the Ohio. In 1966, it was a place where everyone knew everyone, where factory shifts dictated the rhythm of life, and where the Silver Bridge, that elegant suspension span connecting West Virginia to Ohio, stood as a symbol of progress and connection. The bridge had been there since 1928, 38 years of cars and trucks and school buses crossing those gray steel cables twice a day. 38 years of trust. But this story doesn't begin with the bridge. It begins in the ruins. Just north of town lay the old West Virginia Ordnance Works, 7,000 acres of abandoned World War II munitions factories. Locals called it the TNT area. During the war, it had been alive with workers, producing explosives around the clock. But by the 1960s, it had become something else entirely, a maze of crumbling concrete igloos, rusted machinery overtaken by vines, miles of empty roads swallowed by forest. The kind of place where teenagers went to prove their courage, where shadows seemed to move with purpose, where the air itself felt heavy with the residue of abandonment. On the night of November the 15th, 1966, two young couples decided to drive through the TNT area. Roger and Linda Scarberry, Steve and Mary Millette, all in their early 20s, all native to Point Pleasant, all looking for nothing more than a late-night drive to pass the time. What they found would change their lives forever. It was near midnight when Roger turned his car down one of the old access roads. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the skeletal remains of a power plant. And that's when Linda saw it, standing near the entrance, tall, human-shaped, but wrong. 7 feet at least. Gray skin, or was it feathers? And wings, massive wings, folded against its back. But it was the eyes that she would remember most. Red, glowing, not reflecting the headlights, but burning from within. Looking directly at them with an intelligence that made her blood run cold. "What is that?" she whispered. The creature didn't move. It simply stood there, watching, waiting. Roger hit the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires spitting gravel as he wheeled back toward the main road. Behind them, the creature spread its wings, a span so wide it seemed to fill the entire road, and rose into the air, and then it followed them. Steve would later tell the police that the creature kept pace with the car, even as Roger pushed past 100 miles per hour. It flew beside them, above them, its wings beating with a sound like thunder, those red eyes never leaving them. Only when they reached the city limits did it break away, veering off toward the river and vanishing into the night. At 2 a.m, 4 terrified young people stumbled into the Mason County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Millard Halstead listened to their story with the kind of patient skepticism that comes from years of late-night calls. But something about their fear was genuine. These weren't drunk kids spinning tales. These were people who had seen something that shattered their sense of reality. "I know how it sounds," Roger said, his hands still shaking, "but we all saw it. All 4 of us." Halstead drove out to the TNT area with them. They searched the old power plant with flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of any creature, just empty buildings and the wind moving through broken windows. But as they stood there in the cold November night, Halstead felt something he couldn't quite name, a sense of being observed, of something vast and patient watching from just beyond the light. He didn't mention this in his report. By the next morning, word had spread through Point Pleasant like wildfire. The local newspaper, the Point Pleasant Register, ran the story on the front page, not as a joke, not as human interest, but as news. Because in a town this small, when four upstanding young people report seeing something impossible, people listen. Some believed immediately. Others laughed, but everyone talked. And as they talked, other stories began to surface. Stories people had been afraid to share. Stories of strange sounds near the TNT area, of shadows that moved wrong, of animals behaving strangely, refusing to go near certain roads. A woman named Marcella Bennett came forward. Just 2 nights after the Scarberries' encounter, she had been visiting friends who lived near the TNT area. As she walked to her car carrying her infant daughter, something rose from behind a parked vehicle, tall, gray, wings spreading wide, those same burning red eyes fixed on her. She dropped her car keys. Her legs gave out. She couldn't scream, couldn't breathe, could only clutch her baby as the creature stood there, watching them. Her friends had to carry her inside. In those early weeks of November 1966, Point Pleasant found itself caught between 2 realities: the world they had always known, where monsters existed only in movies and folk tales, and a new world where something impossible walked among them. The Silver Bridge still carried its daily traffic. Factory workers still punched their time cards. Children still went to school. Life continued as it always had. But beneath the surface, something had changed. A seed of unease had been planted. And in the coming months, as more people encountered the creature, as more stories emerged from the darkness, that seed would grow into something much larger. Something that would make people look at the familiar differently, question what they thought they knew, wonder if the world was stranger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. They called it the Mothman. A name borrowed from the Batman television show that was popular at the time, a name that made it easier to talk about, easier to process. But names have a way of making things smaller than they are, more manageable. And the Mothman was anything but manageable. It was watching, waiting, and though no one knew it yet, its presence was a countdown to disaster. December 1966. The sightings came faster now, layering one atop another until the entire town seemed caught in a waking nightmare. A building contractor named Newell Partridge sat in his farmhouse 3 miles north of Point Pleasant, watching television. Suddenly, the screen went dark. Static filled the air. And outside, his German shepherd, Bandit, a fearless dog who had never run from anything, began to howl. Partridge stepped onto his porch with a flashlight. The beam swept across his yard and caught something in the barn. 2 red circles, hovering in the darkness, glowing like hot coals. The light didn't reflect off them. It seemed to be absorbed by them. Bandit bolted toward the barn, barking frantically. Partridge called him back, but the dog didn't listen. He ran straight toward those burning eyes, and then his barking stopped abruptly, cut off mid-sound. Partridge never saw his dog again. The next night, the Scarberries were driving near the TNT area again, unable to stay away, drawn by a compulsion they couldn't explain, when they saw a body lying on the side of the road. It looked like a large dog. As Roger slowed down, the body lifted its head. Red eyes blazed in the darkness. It was Bandit, but something was wrong with him. He didn't respond when they called, just stared at them with those glowing eyes before standing up and walking stiffly into the woods, moving like something else was controlling his legs. By mid-December, the local authorities had received over 100 reports, not just from fringe figures or attention seekers, but from police officers, factory workers, housewives, teachers, people with nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking up. And patterns began to emerge. The Mothman appeared most often near the TNT area, but sightings ranged across a 15-mile radius. It was seen perched on rooftops, standing in fields, flying over the river, always watching, never attacking. Those who saw it up close reported the same details. 7 feet tall, gray or brown, muscular build, enormous wings that it could fold completely against its body. No visible head, just those eyes set directly into its shoulders, burning red with an intensity that felt almost alive. And everyone who encountered it felt the same thing, an overwhelming sense of dread. Not fear of being attacked, but something deeper. A bone-deep certainty that something terrible was coming, that the creature's presence was a harbinger of something worse. But a harbinger of what? Points. Pleasant split into camps, those who believed and those who didn't. The skeptics had their explanations ready. It was a sandhill crane, they said, a large bird that could stand 6 feet tall and had red markings around its eyes, or mass hysteria, sparked by the first report and fed by imagination, or teenagers in costumes playing pranks. The believers pointed to the witnesses, respected members of the community. Multiple people seeing the same thing at the same time, the terror in their eyes when they spoke about it, a terror that couldn't be faked. But beneath the arguments and the debates, something else was happening. The town was changing. People started avoiding the TNT area after dark. They installed extra locks on their doors. They watched the shadows more carefully. Trust began to erode. Not trust in each other, but trust in the fundamental order of things. The certainty that the world worked the way they thought it did. And then the other phenomena began. Phone calls in the middle of the night. Static-filled connections where mechanical voices spoke in languages no one recognized. TVs and radios malfunctioning when the Mothman was near. Electrical disturbances throughout the town with no identifiable source. Some reported seeing strange lights in the sky, orbs that moved with purpose, hovering over the river or the TNT area before vanishing. The connection to UFO phenomena was impossible to ignore, though what it meant remained unclear. A local reporter named Mary Heyer became the unofficial chronicler of the phenomena. Her office at the Point Pleasant Register was flooded with calls, people reporting encounters, sharing theories, asking if she had heard anything new. And then she started receiving visits from strange men. They came in pairs usually, always well-dressed in dark suits, always claiming to represent government agencies or scientific institutions. They asked detailed questions about the sightings, took notes in small notebooks, spoke with flat, emotionless voices, but something about them was off. Their suits were slightly out of style. They seemed unfamiliar with basic social conventions. And when Mary tried to verify their credentials later, she found no record of the agencies they claimed to represent. Others in town reported similar visits, men in black, they started calling them. Another piece of the puzzle that made no sense. Another thread in a tapestry of strangeness that seemed to grow more complex by the day. In January 1967, a journalist from New York named John Keel arrived in Point Pleasant. He had been investigating strange phenomena across the country, UFO sightings, paranormal events, unexplained occurrences. When he heard about the Mothman, he knew he had to see it for himself. Keel embedded himself in the community. He interviewed witnesses, spent nights in the TNT area, collected every scrap of information he could find, and the more he learned, the more convinced he became that something genuinely anomalous was happening. But he also began to notice something else, a sense of building tension, like a storm gathering on the horizon. "These people aren't just scared," he wrote in his notes. "They're waiting for something to happen, like the whole town is holding its breath." He would later write that the Mothman sightings felt less like random occurrences and more like a sequence, a progression building towards some unknown climax. He just didn't know what that climax would be. Through all of this, the Silver Bridge stood constant, a reassuring presence, a symbol of normalcy and connection. Every day, thousands of cars crossed its span, commuters heading to work in Ohio, families driving to shop in Point Pleasant, trucks hauling goods between states. The bridge was as much a part of the town's identity as the river itself. Yes, it was old. Yes, it sometimes groaned under heavy loads. But it had been there for nearly 40 years. Engineers had inspected it. It had survived floods and storms and endless cycles of freeze and thaw. The bridge was solid, trustworthy, eternal, or so everyone believed. But in the steel skeleton of that bridge, in the countless eye-bars and pins and connections that held it, suspended over the river, something was failing. A crack no wider than a pencil line was slowly growing in one critical component, growing with every vehicle that crossed, every truck that added its weight to the load. The bridge was dying, had been dying for years. But everyone's eyes were turned toward the sky, watching for the Mothman, scanning the shadows, waiting for the monster to strike. No one thought to look at what they trusted most. As winter deepened and 1967 marched toward its end, the character of the sightings changed. The Mothman appeared more frequently, more urgently. Witnesses reported that it seemed agitated, moving with a frantic energy that hadn't been present before. Some saw it circling the TNT area. Others spotted it near the river, standing on the banks and staring at the water. At the bridge, Mary Heyer received a call from a woman who lived near the river. She had seen the creature perched on top of the silver bridge, its wings spread wide, its eyes blazing in the darkness. It had stayed there for nearly an hour before flying away. When Heyer asked why she hadn't reported it sooner, the woman's voice was quiet. Because I didn't want to believe what it meant. What did it mean? What was the Mothman trying to tell them? These were the questions that haunted Point Pleasant as December 1967 approached, as Christmas decorations went up on Main Street and families made their holiday plans. As life continued its familiar rhythms despite the strangeness that had infected the town, the answer was coming, was already written in steel and stress and structural failure, but no one could read the warning signs. No one understood that the monster they feared was trying to save them from something worse, something that would happen in just a few short days. There is an ancient human instinct to see patterns in chaos, to find meaning in the random. To believe that the universe might, in its way, send us signals. An omen is a warning dressed in symbol, a message from somewhere beyond our understanding, telling us that danger approaches. But omens are useless if we cannot read them. If we mistake the warning for the threat itself. Point Pleasant had its omen. For 13 months, the Mothman had haunted their town. And for 13 months, they had treated it as the danger, the thing to fear, the monster in the shadows. But what if they had it backward? What if the creature wasn't the threat but the alarm? Let's talk about the Silver Bridge. It was an engineering marvel when it opened in 1928. An I-bar suspension bridge, one of the first of its kind. Instead of using cables spun from thousands of steel wires, it used solid steel bars linked together like a chain. Each I-bar had a large loop at each end, connected by a pin to the next bar in the sequence. The design was elegant, efficient, and critically dependent on every single component functioning perfectly. Because unlike a cable bridge, where multiple wires provide redundancy, an I-bar bridge has no backup. If one bar fails, the entire span collapses. By 1967, the Silver Bridge had been carrying traffic for 39 years. Years of heavy trucks. Years of salt and moisture and temperature changes. Years of stress cycling through steel that was never designed to last forever. Engineers in the 1960s were beginning to understand metal fatigue in ways their predecessors hadn't. They knew that steel subjected to repeated stress could develop microscopic cracks, that these cracks could grow slowly, invisibly, until one day, without warning, the metal would fail catastrophically. But that knowledge came too late for Point Pleasant. On the Ohio side of the Silver Bridge, on the north chain of the suspension system, a particular I-bar bore an enormous load, bar number 330. It supported the weight of the entire northern chain. Every car, every truck, every ton of force transmitted through the bridge structure came to bear on that single piece of steel. And inside bar number 330, invisible to any inspection, a crack was growing. It had started years earlier, maybe from a manufacturing defect, maybe from stress corrosion, maybe simply from decades of relentless, unending load. The crack was tiny at first, no wider than a human hair, too small to detect with the inspection methods available at the time, but metal fatigue doesn't rest. Every vehicle that crossed the bridge made the crack a little larger. Every heavy truck, every bus full of school children, every station wagon packed with Christmas presents, the crack grew, slowly, patiently, inevitably. And no one knew it was there. But there were warnings, human warnings, the kind that should have been heeded. In the months before the collapse, drivers reported strange sounds when crossing the bridge, a groaning noise, like metal under stress. Some described feeling the bridge sway more than usual. Others noticed that the roadway seemed to dip in certain places. Complaints were filed. People called the highway department, expressed concern. The concerns were noted. Inspections were scheduled. Engineers looked at the bridge and saw what they expected to see. An aging structure, yes, but one that was fundamentally sound, the kind of wear and tear you'd expect from any bridge this old. The inspections found nothing alarming, because the critical failure point was hidden inside the steel, where no one could see it without destructive testing. And you don't cut into a functioning bridge to check for problems that might not exist. So the bridge remained open, the traffic continued, and the crack continued to grow. The month opened cold and gray. Point Pleasant prepared for Christmas with the same rituals it had followed for decades. Lights on Main Street, wreaths on doors, children writing letters to Santa. The Mothman sightings had decreased. Some took this as a sign that the phenomena was ending, that whatever strange chapter Point Pleasant had been living through was finally closing. But a few witnesses reported something different. They said the Mothman seemed frantic now, desperate, flying erratically, appearing and disappearing as if trying to communicate something urgent. Marcella Bennett, the woman who had frozen in terror when she first saw the creature, reported another encounter. She was driving home from work when she saw it standing on the side of Route 62 near the bridge. As her car passed, it launched into the air and flew parallel to her, keeping pace. She could see its eyes through her window, blazing red, fixed on her with an intensity that felt almost pleading. Then it veered away, flying toward the bridge, circling it 3 times before vanishing into the night. She told her husband that night, "It's trying to warn us about something. I don't know what. But something terrible is coming." She was right. She had less than a week. Here is a truth about human nature. We trust what we can see and touch. We trust what has always been reliable. And we dismiss warnings that challenge our sense of stability. The people of Point Pleasant trusted the Silver Bridge because it had never failed them. For 39 years, it had stood solid, carried them safely across the river, connected them to the world beyond. Why would they doubt it now? And even if some inner voice whispered warnings, even if some people felt uneasy crossing the bridge, what were they supposed to do? The bridge was the primary crossing, the only practical route for daily commuters. Avoiding it meant hours of detour, so they did what humans do when faced with nameless dread. They ignored it, pushed it down, told themselves they were being irrational. The Mothman was the focus of fear because it was visible, strange, other, a clear target for anxiety. The bridge was too familiar to fear, too necessary, too trusted, and that trust would cost 46 people their lives. December 15th, 1967, a Friday. The last shopping day before Christmas for most people. Point Pleasant's Main Street was busy with shoppers. Ohio workers made their usual commute home across the bridge. The weather was cold but not brutal. Traffic was heavy but moving. Everything was normal. At the Ohio approach to the Silver Bridge, traffic backed up slightly. Holiday traffic. Nothing unusual. Cars and trucks lined up, waiting their turn to cross. Among them, a pickup truck loaded with Christmas presents, a station wagon with 3 children in the back seat. A truck hauling industrial equipment, families, workers, students home from college, all of them trusting the bridge that had never failed. On the north side of the bridge, invisible to everyone, inside the steel of I-bar 330, the crack had grown to critical size. The metal around it was under tremendous stress. Microscopic fractures spiderwebbed through the surrounding steel. The I-bar was holding, but barely. The margin of safety had eroded to almost nothing. One more vehicle, one more ton of weight, one more cycle of stress. That's all it would take. The precise moment would be debated later. Some said 4:58. Others said 5 and 4. But the exact time doesn't matter. What matters is that in a single instant, I-bar 330 failed. The crack had grown too large. The steel could no longer support the load. The I-bar fractured completely, splitting in 2. And like a chain with a broken link, the entire north suspension system collapsed. The bridge didn't fall slowly. There was no time to react, no warning. One moment it was solid. The next, it was gone. The sound was unlike anything the witnesses would ever forget. Not an explosion, not a crash. Something worse, something more final. 31 vehicles were on the bridge when it failed, some near the Ohio side, some near the West Virginia side, some in the middle of the span. All of them suspended 200 feet above the winter-cold Ohio River. When the north I-bar snapped, the north chain released instantly. The entire northern section of the roadway dropped, but the bridge was interconnected. The southern chain was still intact, still holding. For a fraction of a second, the span hung twisted, the roadway tilting at an impossible angle, Cars began to slide. People screamed. Brakes locked. Metal scraped against metal as vehicles collided, piled up, began to fall, and then the southern chain failed. The stress of the northern collapse had transferred instantly, overwhelming the remaining structure. More eye bars snapped, pins sheared, steel cables whipped through the air like striking snakes. The entire center span collapsed into the river. 200 feet of roadway, 31 vehicles, 64 people, all of it falling in a matter of seconds. Those who survived the fall would remember the sensation of weightlessness, the moment of unreality when the solid world beneath them simply vanished, the stomach-dropping freefall, the desperate prayers offered in the heartbeat before impact. The river was 44 degrees Fahrenheit. The vehicles hit the water and began to sink immediately, weighed down by steel and cargo. Some broke through the ice that had formed along the edges. Others landed in deeper water and sank straight down. People trapped in their cars hammered at windows that wouldn't break, clawed at doors that wouldn't open, felt the cold water rise past their chests, their necks, their faces, as the river claimed them. On both sides of the river, people heard the sound, saw the bridge that had always been there suddenly absent from the skyline. Some thought it was an explosion. Others thought they were imagining things. How could a bridge simply disappear? But the screams from the river left no doubt. Within minutes, emergency services converged on both shores. Firefighters, police, ambulances. Volunteers rushing from their homes with boats, ropes, flashlights, anyone who could help. The scene was chaos. Survivors clung to debris in the freezing water, their strength fading fast. Bodies floated face down between chunks of ice. Submerged vehicles were barely visible in the dark water, marked only by trails of bubbles as the last air pockets escaped. Rescue boats pushed through the debris field, pulling people from the water. But hypothermia works fast. Even those who survived the initial fall were dying from cold. Their muscles seized, their breathing slowed, their hearts struggled to pump blood through bodies that were shutting down. Divers went down immediately, despite the terrible conditions. Zero visibility, treacherous currents, submerged wreckage that could trap them in an instant. They worked by feel, reaching into submerged cars, checking for survivors. Sometimes they found people still alive, still conscious, still desperately trying to escape. Pulling them free, getting them to the surface, was a race against seconds. More often, they found people who had already drowned, families still buckled into their seats, children pressed against windows, hands frozen in positions that told stories of final, desperate attempts to survive. By midnight, the immediate rescue operation had ended, not because they had recovered everyone, but because they had recovered everyone who could possibly still be alive. The official count, 46 dead, 18 survived, 31 vehicles in the river, but the numbers didn't capture it, couldn't capture it. A mother and her 3 children killed together, a young couple married less than a year. A truck driver just doing his job, a grandmother who had been Christmas shopping, students home from college for the holidays, entire families erased in an instant, brothers and sisters who would never see each other again, parents who would bury their children just days before Christmas. The bodies were brought to a temporary morgue, identified by loved ones who had to look at faces they knew, now cold and still. Some of the dead were never recovered, their vehicles buried in river silt, their bodies swept downstream by the current. Those who survived carried their own kind of death. One man had been near the West Virginia side when the bridge collapsed. He felt the roadway tilt, saw the cars ahead of him slide toward the river, and jumped from his vehicle. He landed on a section of roadway that was still attached to the shore. Watched helplessly as the rest of the bridge fell away in front of him. A woman escaped from her submerged car by kicking out the windshield. She clawed her way to the surface through water so cold it felt like knives, emerged gasping into the winter air, and clung to debris until rescuers found her. She would lose 3 toes to frostbite and live with nightmares for the rest of her life. A man pulled his wife and daughter from their sinking car and swam with them toward shore. His wife made it. His daughter made it. But he ran out of strength 10 feet from the bank and went under. Rescuers pulled him out, but he never regained consciousness. The survivors spoke of the sound, the feeling of weightlessness, the shock of impact, the terrible clarity that came with knowing they were about to die. And they spoke of luck. the arbitrary, the inexplicable nature of survival, how one car fell and another didn't, how one person escaped and another drowned, how the difference between life and death came down to which part of the bridge you were on, which direction you were facing, whether your car landed roof up or roof down. There was no sense to it, no justice, just random chance and physics and the cruelty of circumstance. Through the night, people gathered on both sides of the river, families waiting for news, friends searching for friends, the entire community of Point Pleasant standing witness to the worst disaster in their history. News spread quickly. By morning, reporters from across the country had descended on the town. Camera crews filmed the twisted wreckage still jutting from the river. Reporters interviewed survivors, witnesses, officials. But no amount of coverage could capture what it felt like, what it meant. This wasn't just a bridge collapse. This was the destruction of certainty, the shattering of trust, the revelation that the things we depend on most can fail without warning. And in the midst of the grief and shock and horror, a question began to form. A question that would haunt Point Pleasant for years to come. Why didn't we see this coming? In all the chaos and tragedy of that night, one detail went largely unnoticed. One fact that would only gain significance later, when people had time to think, to process, to look back at the 13 months that had led to this moment. The Mothman was gone. After 13 months of sightings, after hundreds of reports, after becoming woven into the fabric of daily life in Point Pleasant, the creature vanished. The last confirmed sighting had been just days before the collapse, the creature circling the bridge, flying frantically, eyes blazing red in the darkness. And after December 15th, nothing. Not a single credible sighting, not one more report. The Mothman simply ceased to exist, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, as if the warning it tried to give had expired, as if whatever force had brought it to Point Pleasant had released it once the disaster finally occurred. The timing was impossible to ignore. But what did it mean? Was the Mothman connected to the collapse? Had it somehow known what was coming? Or was it just coincidence? The end of one strange chapter happening to align with the beginning of a tragic one? These were questions that would consume investigators, researchers, and believers for decades. But on that cold December night, as rescue workers pulled bodies from the river and families waited for news that would never come, the Mothman's absence was just one more piece of a puzzle no one had the energy to solve. The monster was gone. But the real nightmare had just begun. In the days following the collapse, engineers descended on Point Pleasant, the National Transportation Safety Board, the Federal Highway Administration, bridge experts from across the country, all of them asking the same question: why? The wreckage was carefully documented. Pieces of the bridge were recovered from the river, the steel was analyzed, the design was scrutinized, computer models were built, calculations were checked and rechecked, and slowly a picture emerged: I-bar 330, the critical component in the north suspension chain. It had failed due to stress corrosion cracking, a defect that had been present in the steel for years, possibly since manufacturing. A tiny flaw that had grown microscopically with every load cycle until it reached critical size. The failure was what engineers call brittle. No warning, no gradual deformation. Just instantaneous fracture when the crack reached a critical length. Could it have been prevented? In hindsight, yes. With modern inspection methods, with better understanding of fatigue, with redundancy built into the design. But in 1967, with the knowledge and technology available at the time, the failure was essentially unpredictable. The bridge had been inspected regularly. Engineers had deemed it safe. There was no way to see inside the steel to find the hidden crack. It was, the official report concluded, a catastrophic failure that could not have been reasonably foreseen. But that cold engineering assessment offered little comfort to the families who had lost loved ones. To a town that had trusted a bridge that killed 46 people, Point Pleasant never fully recovered. How could it? 46 deaths in a town of 7,000, that's approximately 1 in every 150 people. In a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone, it meant that virtually every family was touched by the tragedy. Children lost parents, parents lost children, husbands lost wives. The web of grief stretched across the entire town. Christmas 1967 was marked by funerals instead of celebrations. Presents went unwrapped, trees stood dark, the holiday season became forever associated with loss. And the survivors, both those who had been on the bridge and those who had lost loved ones, carried wounds that never fully healed. Post-traumatic stress wasn't widely understood in 1967. There were no support groups, no counseling services, no framework for processing collective trauma. People simply lived with it, woke up every morning and tried to function, drove across the new bridge when it was eventually built, fighting panic every time, saw the river and remembered what it had taken. The lawsuit that followed was bitter and protracted. Families sued the bridge operators, the state of West Virginia, anyone who might be held accountable. The legal process dragged on for years, reopening wounds, forcing people to relive the worst moments of their lives in depositions and court testimony. In the end, settlements were reached. Money was paid, but no amount of money could restore what had been lost. In the months and years after the collapse, something interesting happened to the Mothman legend. Initially, some blamed the creature for the disaster, said it had cursed the bridge, caused the collapse through some supernatural means. This narrative offered a kind of comfort. If the disaster was caused by something otherworldly, then it couldn't happen again. It was a one-time event, an aberration. But as time passed, another interpretation began to take hold. What if the Mothman hadn't caused the disaster? What if it had been trying to prevent it? The pattern was impossible to ignore. 13 months of sightings, increasing frequency and urgency as December approached. The creature appearing near the bridge in the final days, flying frantically, eyes blazing, and then vanishing immediately after the collapse. It looked less like a monster and more like a warning, a desperate attempt by something beyond human understanding to communicate danger. This interpretation transformed the Mothman from villain to tragic hero, a being that had tried to save Point Pleasant and failed because humans couldn't understand what it was trying to tell them. John Keel, the journalist who had investigated the sightings, published a book in 1975 called The Mothman Prophecies. In it, he explored this idea, that the creature was some kind of harbinger, an omen that appeared before disasters to warn those who could read the signs. The book found an audience hungry for meaning, for a way to make sense of tragedy. The idea that the universe might send warnings, even if we're too blind to understand them, offered a strange kind of comfort. Point Pleasant embraced the legend. In 2003, they erected a 12-foot statue of the Mothman in the center of town, started an annual Mothman festival, turned the creature that had once terrified them into a source of identity and tourist revenue. But beneath the commercialization, beneath the festivals and the t-shirts and the museum, something genuine remained. A community wrestling with trauma, trying to find meaning in loss, transforming a monster into mythology as a way of processing the unprocessable. The Silver Bridge collapse changed bridge engineering forever. In the immediate aftermath, every I-bar bridge in America was inspected. Several were found to have similar design flaws. Some were retrofitted with additional support. Others were demolished and rebuilt. New inspection protocols were developed. Redundancy became a core principle of bridge design. No single component should be capable of causing total collapse. Fracture mechanics became a standard part of engineering education. The disaster directly led to the creation of the National Bridge Inspection Standards in 1968. For the first time, the federal government mandated regular inspections of all bridges on public roads, established criteria for structural adequacy, created a system for identifying and addressing deteriorating infrastructure. In a very real sense, the 46 people who died on the Silver Bridge saved thousands of lives in the decades that followed. Their tragedy forced changes that made bridges safer, made engineers more cautious, made the public more aware of infrastructure failure as a real and present danger. But that knowledge came too late for Point Pleasant, too late for the families driving home that December evening, too late to prevent the disaster that engineering advances might have avoided just a few years later. More than 50 years have passed since the Silver Bridge collapsed. The town has rebuilt. A new bridge spans the river. Life has continued. But the question remains. The question that has haunted Point Pleasant since that December night. Was the Mothman real? Skeptics have their explanations. Misidentified birds, mass hysteria, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, the desire to find supernatural meaning in random tragedy. These explanations are reasonable. rational, grounded in what we understand about human psychology and perception. But they don't account for the witnesses. Dozens of people from all walks of life, people with nothing to gain and everything to lose, all describing the same creature, the same burning red eyes, the same overwhelming sense of dread. They don't account for the timing. 13 months of sightings ending the exact day of the collapse, the creature's increasing urgency in the final weeks, the way it seemed to be drawn to the bridge. They don't account for what the witnesses felt. Not just fear, but certainty. The bone-deep knowledge that something terrible was approaching, that the creature's presence meant danger. Maybe the Mothman was exactly what it appeared to be, a creature unknown to science, a being from somewhere beyond our understanding, a harbinger that appears before disasters to warn those who might listen. Or maybe it was something more subtle. A manifestation of collective anxiety, a way for the human subconscious to process warnings too subtle to consciously perceive. The town sensing on some instinctive level that the bridge was failing, that danger was approaching, and projecting that knowledge onto a shared vision. Or maybe it was nothing at all. Coincidence, imagination. Stories that grew in the telling until they became myth. We will never know for certain. The evidence is anecdotal, the creature never captured, no definitive proof either way. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps mystery is more honest than certainty. Because the deeper truth of Point Pleasant isn't about whether the Mothman was real. It's about what we ignore, what we fail to see, the warnings we dismiss because they make us uncomfortable. The Silver Bridge collapsed because humans trusted what they could see, believed in what had always worked, dismissed concerns that challenged their sense of security. Engineers said the bridge was safe, so it must be safe. It had stood for 40 years, so it would stand for 40 more. The idea that it could fail seemed absurd, impossible, until it wasn't. How many times do we make the same mistake? Trust systems because they have always functioned. Ignore warnings because they're inconvenient. Assume that tomorrow will be like today. The Mothman, whether real or imagined, represented a different kind of knowledge, instinct, intuition, the sense that something is wrong even when you can't articulate why. And Point Pleasant ignored it, not out of stupidity or negligence, but because humans are built to trust the familiar and dismiss the strange, to choose comfort over anxiety, to hope that unease is meaningless rather than face the possibility of danger. 46 people died because a crack in steel went unnoticed, but perhaps they also died because humans are fundamentally bad at reading warnings, at accepting that disaster can strike without clear signals, at understanding that sometimes the monster in the shadows is less dangerous than what we take for granted. Today, if you drive through Point Pleasant, you'll see the Mothman statue standing in Gun Park, 12 feet of polished steel, wings spread, eyes blazing. Tourists take photos with it. Children climb on its base. It's become a symbol of the town's identity. You'll see the Mothman Museum on Main Street, filled with newspaper clippings and eyewitness accounts and memorabilia from a strange year in the 1960s when something impossible walked among them. You'll cross the Silver Bridge Memorial Bridge, the new span that replaced the one that fell. A modern structure with redundant supports and regular inspections. A bridge built from the lessons learned in blood and river water. And if you talk to the older residents, the ones who remember that December night, you'll hear the same note in their voices. Loss, trauma, but also something else. A kind of pride that their town has become part of a larger story, that their tragedy means something, that the monster that haunted them has become a legend. But late at night, when the tourists have gone home, and the museum has closed, and the river runs black beneath the bridge, some people still look to the shadows, still scan the sky, still remember when something impossible walked among them, still wonder if it might come back, if somewhere in the darkness, red eyes might be watching, waiting, trying once again to warn us about something we're too blind to see. Because the Mothman's greatest prophecy wasn't about the Silver Bridge, it was about human nature, about our inability to read warnings until it's too late, about the difference between the dangers we fear and the dangers that actually kill us. And that prophecy remains unfulfilled, because we're still ignoring warnings, still trusting what we shouldn't, still dismissing the uncomfortable truths that might save us. Somewhere, in some town we've never heard of, disaster is approaching. The signs are there if anyone would look. The warnings are being given if anyone would listen, but we won't, we never do. Not until the bridge falls, not until it's too late. On December 15, 1967, at approximately 5:00 p.m., 46 people died when the Silver Bridge collapsed into the Ohio River. They were mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, workers and shoppers. They were people going about their ordinary lives, trusting in the ordinary world. Their deaths were not meaningless. They led to changes that saved lives, to better engineering, to deeper understanding, to a legacy written in steel and stone. But they were also preventable. If we had looked closer, listened better, taken warnings seriously instead of dismissing them as impossible. The Mothman, whatever it was, has become a symbol of that failure, a reminder that monsters come in many forms. That sometimes the thing we fear is trying to save us, that the real danger is always closer than we think, and the question it leaves us with isn't whether it was real, it's whether we're brave enough to see the warnings that surround us now, to question what we trust, to look beyond the comfortable and the familiar, to understand that somewhere in the darkness, disaster is always waiting. And the only thing standing between us and catastrophe is whether we're willing to look for the cracks in the steel, before the bridge falls, before it's too late.